My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. I'm always fascinated to begin by just understanding, what did your journey into scholarship look like? Did you sense an immediate call? Was it kind of a gradual thing? How did you land where you landed?
Well, I was always interested in reading and eventually writing, and certainly enjoyed the classes I had. Very good public high school in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I was an undergraduate at Wheaton College and had several. I was English major and had several inspiring teachers.
Okay.
I think what pushed me toward history was sort of in the later years of college and years immediately thereafter. Trying to understand what I should do, which I should be as a Christian person, and for that, historical study proved very, very, very helpful.
Okay.
I had been raised in a church and was certainly benefited from the Christian community in Iowa that I was raised in, but I probably didn't appreciate some aspects of that experience the way I should have, but found the reading about the Protestant Reformation clarified not just my attitude toward the faith, but myself as a Christian person.
Okay.
And it just and then there were different career options I was exploring, and I thought, well, I should take a little time to just go deeper into to what has been helpful to me with the historical understandings of the Christian faith. So I said, well, I'll do a master's degree in church history, which I did at Trinity Seminary in
Okay.
Deerfield, Illinois. And that work proved very, very interesting. And I got to the end, and I thought, well, maybe I should just try to apply to graduate school and see what happens. And I did. I was accepted at Vanderbilt University, and
Okay.
and came close to finishing the degree, and it's time to either find a job in academia or do something else, and I was able to find a job. So there was never any real, what should I say? I didn't necessarily feel called to be
Okay.
an academic, but I certainly thought eventually in vocational terms, in terms of a Christian calling, that
Okay.
uh, I had been prepared to teach and read and write, and was very pleased that the opportunities arose to pursue that vocation.
Was there an initial book that was kind of your foray into the Reformation? Like, was it, or it did?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
It was Roland Bainton's 1950 biography, "Here I Stand," of
Okay.
Martin Luther, which, for me anyways, clarified the real importance of understanding the Christian faith as a gift,
Okay.
and human Christian exertions as a response to the gift, rather than anything else. So
Okay.
yes, that really was very important.
And this question may be, I mean, hard to answer. I don't know if it's like a fish being in water, but have you identified through the years of ways in which being a Christian has changed the way that you do history, or maybe the implications? Uh,
Yes, that is a pertinent question. On one level, I think functioning as a Christian historian is very much like functioning as a Christian plumber, a Christian
sure.
salesperson, a Christian lawyer, so that for a believer to pursue what God has called him or her to do, I think is to put your mind and heart into it, to balance it with responsibilities of family and church. So it's not, but not to be embarrassed about being called to do something that's honorable. I don't know about being called to be a crook or something like that. That would be uh, I'm probably, I think, on the most important things. Christian historians should function like Christian anything else, but
Yeah, that makes
certainly
sense.
in the practice of history, I think there's a kind of natural inclination to choose subjects that would be personally pertinent. Although it certainly is the case that there are many fine Christian believing historians who work on things like, the economic development of the China in the Middle Ages,
Sure.
or work on diplomatic history. But I do think believing historians will always have the conviction that human actions have a moral dimension that's more than just a response to local circumstances and quick economic or social determinants. So in the background, I think, is the Christian teaching that all people are made in the image of God, that the institutions of humankind are made possible because of God's loving creativity. I don't myself think that being a Christian will give you any, what should I say, any special methods.
Sure.
History relies on research.
Yeah.
It relies on assessing documents and questions open to anybody. Actually, that's one of the, I think, really, really valuable things as a believing historian, is to realize how much you're going to learn from historians who either are indifferent to or really not really interested at all in Christian faith. In my case, I got interested particularly in early American history through the work of historians Perry Miller and Edmund Morgan, both of whom were extraordinary in their research breadth and in the depth of interpretations. Neither were believers, and both claimed to be non-believers. I'm not sure whether I actually take that entirely for credit, but what they exemplified is work aiming at understanding people in their context. Edmund Morgan once wrote a wonderful review of a book on the Salem witch trials. And he praised it. He said it was very nicely done. And the author had used contemporary psychological theories to explain what happened. And Morgan was properly complimentary. But then at the end of the review, he said, well, the people the author is writing about, it was just as smart as he is. They thought that God and the world of evil spirits was active. And, they have every much as right. Let's see, I'm not going to get exact phrase, but it's just as likely that they were right as the author is right.
Sure.
So here's a non-believer crediting what people at a different time and place believed as they organized their lives. It was just a wonderful example to the historical guild that would always want to translate Christian things into something else. Sure. But then also a real example to Christian historians who might be prepared to not give full credit to motives of people who aren't believers. So so in other words, I think that the task of historians is not to be apologists. The task of historians is not to be evangelists, although hopefully in other parts of your life you support apologetics and evangelism, but it is to see the people in the past with as much clarity and as much empathy as possible.
So would you say this is true, that a Christian historian can do good history in studying, I don't know if you might call it I don't know, a secular
situation
anything, or something,
right.
And in the same way, an unbelieving historian could do good history studying kind of the Reformation?
Certainly up to certain limits, yes. And I think always I've taught many years at Wheaton College and then at Notre Dame with different courses, like in the history of recent world Christianity. Some of the best work was done by believers, but some very good work and very helpful work was done by those who you couldn't tell whether they were believers or not. The error of anybody, believing or not, is to look at the past and say, well, here's what people say and here's what people do. But what they're really, really concerned about is, and then it's economics or society or flight from God or to, but and it may be, I mean, it may be that there are these ultimate things, but if you conclude that what an action in the past means something fundamentally at the bottom different than the people, then what you're doing is bringing your understanding of the world into play. And we always do that. We of course
Sure.
do that all the
Yeah.
time. But I think that the special calling of historians is to just hold off.
Yeah.
And for studying the history of Christianity, I think as a believer, it really works to show that churches are fallible, believers are fallible, but somehow the church goes on. How does this happen? Well,
Yeah.
it raises a really interesting question.
Yeah.
The history itself doesn't answer the question, but my Christian belief says, well, the church somehow survives, not because we got such great people, but because God is making it happen.
Yeah.
But that's not really a historic, well, it is a kind of it's a historical judgment
Okay.
more than it is a historical conclusion.
That's a very good point. This is maybe a weird question or a silly question, but do you think even, I mean, you're bringing biases in whatever your worldview is, but at times
Right.
when an unbeliever is doing again history on maybe a Christian event or a period situation, do you think they can at all be, come in with less of those evangelical assumptions that might get in the way of
Yeah.
doing good history?
Yes. And that does happen. There's been some really interesting books recently on, I mean, I studied, as I think I told you, the use of the Bible in American history, mostly the 17th and 18th and 19th century. And there's been some really interesting books recently on leaders of slave rebellions, Denmark Vesey in Charleston, and then
Okay.
Nat Turner in Virginia. There's been a lot of scholarship on these, and all of the scholars recognize that the leaders of slave rebellion used a lot of religious language.
Okay.
But usually, that religious language is, well, not being discounted, has been kind of set aside. But there actually been two or three books recently would say, well, look, let's start where those people started and see what happens. So that to me is a really kind of respectful historical work. And when people take that as a possibility, they see, for example, in the case of Nat Turner, that he very likely had a kind of, we would say today, a charismatic evangelical foundation that may have been influenced by the way in which the students of Jonathan Edwards had popularized certain Christian teachings
Okay.
before he thought the Lord God had called him to strike out violently against slavery. So that's the kind of, and I don't know if the historian has done this, where he stands personally, but that's the kind of empathetic treatment that I think a believer would be more likely to do, just because a believer would say, well, a person's claim about God may actually have a foundational place in their lives.
Sure.
But to the contrary, sometimes I think believing historians want to spiritualize things in the past that really don't need to be spiritualized, or will neglect the way in which Christian, sometimes proper Christian expression hides some really bad problems, deep problems. So in the same sense that in personal life, we all need others to be challenging us to think more clearly and more self-critically.
Yeah.
I think it's the same for academics in any kind of field.
Sure.
And actually, thinkers, people who are thinking about any sort of things.
Yeah. All that's really interesting because I find myself, and maybe other people do this too, when I go to read a book on history, especially if it has to do with church history, I find myself wondering and trying to figure out, is this person a believer? Because
Yes,
in my
and
head, I'm
makes
like, I want to, it's, I need to read the perspective here from a believer. So
right.
recently I was just sitting down to read Dominion by Tom Holland.
Oh,
And my
yes,
mind
very good.
immediately is trying to figure
Yeah,
out, Googling and like, is Tom Holland a believer? And as you're pointing out, like, I mean, good history could be done by the unbeliever and maybe even
right,
remove some blinders for me. But that's my natural bent.
right.
Be like,
That's a very good example of a book that's hard to tell because
yeah,
perspective on the preaching of the Apostle Paul is so positive. But I think the specific claim of the book is, whatever you think about the teaching of the Apostle Paul, it has had an immense impact in Western history.
Sure. Yeah.
And that, I think, in my view, he's quite convincing. But then the question, natural question is, well, impact in Western history is one thing, but is it true?
Yeah.
And those are the kind of questions that I think he leaves open-ended. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think almost anybody who would get into that book would want to know where the author
Yeah.
stands.
Yeah. But I don't know, you probably have a better perspective, probably a relationship there, but I wonder if sometimes Tom Holland or others, maybe there's advantage in trying to hide it a little. I don't know, like
Yeah,
Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings and
sure,
not necessarily
sure.
wanting, you know,
Right,
the Christian theme to be painted over the whole.
right, right, right. Yeah, I think Christian historians writing about uh, Christian groups or people in the past that they think commendable, you really want the research to carry the
Sure.
carry the message. You don't want to be pointing out, well, this is a wonderful person, wonderful believer, but
Yeah.
because I think if you do that, then the suspicion will be raised in readers' mind, well, is the evidence being cooked here? Does this
Yeah.
person have a perspective that they brought to the research task, which means that that they're not going to recognize things that would undercut their perspective, and will
Yeah.
be looking for only that kind of read. And that's that way of doing things is really dangerous.
Mhm.
It's been done by believing people as much as non-believing,
Sure.
and not with good ends, not with
Yeah.
good results.
Yeah, that made sense. I think again, my kind of natural bent too is thinking, well, if this is written by an unbeliever, it's going to have a negative perspective, which is
But
again a
sometimes
wrong way to look at it. And
yeah, right.
yeah,
Yeah, just to be alert to those
sure.
sorts of things.
Yeah.
Once you're alert, then the many instances where I've read things that I know the author is not favorably inclined, and I know we're probably going to get a kind of dismissive or unfair critique,
Hmm.
and yet learned a great deal just because the research has been so broad and laid out there so you can see it and can follow up if you'd
Yeah.
like to.
Well, you already kind of mentioned it. I know you've done a lot of writing in scripture and American history and that relationship. So I'd be curious just to pick your brain a little with some questions in that kind
Sure.
of arena or area. Can I ask how central? And I'm in Canada, but I assume. Well, we're fascinated with American history, and I feel
Sure.
like it it kind of involves us as the little brother. Anyway, uh, how central was the Bible in America's early settlement and development? And if so, I mean, why was it so central?
Yes, and actually for Protestant Canada and colonial U.S., I think things are quite similar.
Okay.
The way I would put it, I think, is not that the Bible itself was central, but the
Okay.
kind of British Protestant package in which the Bible was central helped form and helped give shape to culture, Protestant colonial cultures in what became Canada and the U.S. both. Um, there were not too many instances like the very early colonies in Massachusetts and New Haven, where the organizers of the colonies actually sat down to write a legal code and tried to do it basically from the Old Testament. So,
Okay.
so the first code of laws written in the first draft of the proposed code of laws in Massachusetts, like in mid to late 1630s, was called Moses's Judicials, and
Interesting.
it's printed, and you have these laws, and in the margin are references,
Okay.
proof text. I mean, there are a few sections where that does not happen
Okay.
very much, but clearly, I think more important than any kind of specific proof text, you just had a moral universe
Okay.
that was shaped by Protestant faith in which the Bible was foundational.
Okay.
Now, man, it's because of the Reformation, Protestants could not realize that Catholics also had actually quite a bit of Bible in their foundation, but because of the antagonism, in the great colonial wars, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, Protestants and the colonies just lined up freedom, uh, Britain, the Bible,
Okay.
against tyranny, France, Catholicism.
Okay.
I mean, there's just the package was there,
Sure.
and interesting things happened. However, one of the areas I've studied now for quite a number of years is biblical arguments concerning slavery.
Okay.
They really don't start until the 1770s and 1780s, but before that time, white European Christians who didn't see any problem with enslavement were communicating a biblical message to the enslaved people, some of whom, not probably too many, but some became believers.
Okay.
So you had a situation where Bible-believing European Protestants wanted to share the gospel message. A few, actually not too many of these, but a few wanted to share the gospel message with the enslaved people. And some of the enslaved people became believers, and believed the biblical message, even though the Bible is being used for enslaving. Now when you get to the 1800s, then the kind of things that are taken for granted are pulled apart. But
yeah, so you're saying they were arguing from Scripture for the promotion of slavery?
Well, not so much. Well, eventually they did, but in the early years, it just kind of taken for granted. I mean, it's always been slavery, and actually, by the time the American colonies are founded by Europeans, getting slaves from Africa is just taken for granted. Although that actually is relatively new. I mean, that's 1500 and not 1000. But the amazing thing to me is that something at the heart of an enslaving society could reach across that fact of enslavement and actually have we would say, a saving Christian message to those who are being enslaved. So in some, I mean, that's there now you have to move to interpretation. Well, how is that possible?
Yeah.
Well, you could say, well, the slaves who accepted Christianity had false consciousness. Well, maybe. But you'd also say the message that the European Bible believers conveyed actually is true. What they said was the Bible is to critique every social political arrangement. They didn't really apply it to themselves, but in theory, that was the theory. And then the Christian enslaved individuals say, well, that's true. There's a Christianity that can be extracted from white European sanction for slavery. And that raises the question, well, how can that be possible? Well, maybe Bible believing always entails more than the Bible believers think it entails.
Sure.
So yes. So again, your basic question is the Bible is taken for granted as a major source of morals, political guidance, general political guidance, and most importantly, Christian instruction.
Okay.
When you get to the founding of the United States, it's more complicated because there's other factors entering in, but certainly that the belief that humans are moral actors, they're responsible for ideally promoting virtue and ideally counteracting vice. It's not an exclusively Christian perspective, not exclusively biblical, but there's an awful lot of Bible teaching that feeds into it.
Do you think then, I don't know, do we simplify it a little too much when always just talk about the founding, a nation built on the Bible, the founding fathers were Christians, like
definitely. Yeah. Okay. This again, I think part of the well, it's a human condition, but then it's a human condition it's made much worse by the social media and the rush to judgment. You
Sure.
really have to say several things about the
Okay.
American founding. Was there a biblical influence? Yes, definitely. Were there other influences that could be judged in a kind of neutral way? Yes, there were ideas of liberty, ideas of vice and virtue
Okay.
that were not unconnected to Christian faith, but you can track them. People like Machiavelli or
Okay.
John Locke or the opponents of the British ruling class who thought the British ruling class was all corrupt. Those ideas factored into the American founding as well. And then I think you have to, it's so clear from a contemporary perspective. The founders of the United States claimed to be fighting for liberty. They thought the Parliament was taking away their liberty and endangering religious freedom and all other kinds of freedom. And there's a few people in the colonies and a few more in England who said, wait a minute, what do you mean liberty? You're revolting because of a 2-penny tax on tea. Well, you've got a million African descended people and who have no liberty. So John Wesley, who didn't like the American, he actually was he thought complaints against Parliament were legitimate,
Okay.
but he thought the American push for so-called liberty was just nonsensical. It was a joke. He
Okay.
said, no, nobody is so tyrannical as he called them Republicans, small r Republicans. So, I mean, that's at least three things. Is
Sure.
there biblical contribution? Yes.
Yep.
Is there a contribution from other things that aren't necessarily biblical, sometimes may even be a little anti-biblical? Yes.
Okay.
Were the founders of the United States, even the believing founders, blind to a lot of really serious moral issues that Christians now, I mean, today, it's very difficult to find any Bible-believing Christians who think that the enslavement of Black people is God's will. But that was sort of taken for granted. So historians are always criticized. You get a question, you say, well, it's complicated. Well, it's complicated. But it is complicated.
Sure.
And so if somebody says, the United States was founded on a biblical basis, we got to get back to that Bible basis. I say, well, what kind of Bible basis? You want to get back to a Bible basis that treats native people as non-human? Well, of course not. Do you want to get back to a Bible basis that engages in quite a bit of suspect propaganda against Britain? So King George was this evil devil. Well, he was a human. He made mistakes, but he was actually a nice man and a good Christian man. So it's complicated.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've in the church, I feel like we're always being like, we got to get back to the early church, which I feel like is a little similar in some ways. Where I mean, we can have a real idealistic view of the early church, and maybe there were some complicated things that we would like not to return to.
I do think that the Christian desire to follow the New Testament, to follow ancient Christianity is a much sounder purpose. Now, there are some difficulties. I think one of the difficulties is just what happens over time. I mean, so back to the question about using the Bible for defending or attacking slavery. The New Testament makes no protest against slavery as such. Is that because the New Testament teaches that today enslavement is appropriate? Well, I'd say no. And then you say, well, why would you say no? And I would say because from the time of Christ and Paul to the present, there have been developments that actually should help us understand the teaching of the Bible applied for our own day. And so, I mean, again, don't want to get too deep into this example, but there were Bible-believing opponents of slavery by the time we get to the 1800s. Would say, well, it's obvious why the Apostle Paul would tell slaves to obey their masters, because You have a few scattered Christian communities around the Mediterranean world. If you get a new, what was regarded as a new kind of Judaism that's attacking the Roman system, well, the Roman system, Rome's going to come down hard. So the Apostle Paul is not saying, when he says, oh, slaves obey your masters, he's not
Yeah.
saying nothing's wrong about slavery. He's
Sure.
saying that the church needs to, in some sense, get along
Yeah.
society the way it is, in order that we can present the gospel message of the kind that, I mean, Tom Holland showed had tremendous social and political impact. So
Yeah.
that's a different kind of interpretive question than, say, interpreting whether the U.S. was founded on a Christian
Sure.
basis.
Yeah.
But it is, again, you want to say it's complicated.
Yeah. 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 No, I mean, I would completely agree. I mean, the early churches are template. Just sometimes
yes,
I'm like, oh, we miss that they weren't just perfect.
And
They're
right, and the Christian message that spread so dramatically in the Mediterranean world was spreading in the Mediterranean world of the first century. So we have now a different world, and
yeah,
believers think, well, the gospel message is still true and pertinent, and it is, but citizens in a democracy can vote on who their leaders are. No
yeah,
Roman citizen got to vote for Augustus.
sure, yeah,
So what's the responsibility of believers if the believers have a say in the political system?
Yeah,
Well, it's going to be different. Now, how different? That means all sorts of good questions, but just realizing that, well, I think that all the churches are on really solid ground to say we want to understand the foundation
yeah,
and follow it as we can. But that's a different thing than saying, at least for
yeah,
so I'm a Presbyterian and
yeah,
not a Pentecostal, which makes a little bit of a difference, but even that's not a huge difference.
sure,
But you have to say, well, the Christian faith is going to develop over time. It's going
yeah,
to flesh out things that are there kind of in seed form in the New Testament are going to flourish.
sure,
That's of course raises theological issues and all sorts of things, but
yeah.
these are important discussions.
I I like you. It's complicated. That's very true. And I mean, in every
You can't get away with saying that too often, but
yeah,
it's usually true.
sure. Can I ask you? I mean, the most fascinating person to me in history has always been Whitefield.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, Dallamore's biography and others.
Yeah.
I mean, am I right in thinking too when Whitefield came over that he saw, like Wesley, saw things that were wrong in
Right.
the
Yes.
slavery situation?
Whitefield is a really interesting person. And I was privileged at Notre Dame to have a very fine dissertation written by Peter Choi, and the book was actually published on Whitefield.
Okay,
Uh,
I'll have to write that
Choi,
down.
Peter Choi, a nice Eerdmans book and something, The Empires in the, and it's fun because I read the Dallimore books and quite a few other books on Whitefield, and came away thinking that he was an extraordinary influence, mostly positive.
Okay.
But even reading Dallimore, you have to want to know, here's a 22 or 3-year-old coming to the colonies, and
Yeah.
pretty soon he's telling people what they should do. And he goes to he has the great tour of New England in 1736 or 7, and then he comes back a couple years later, and there's not so much interest, and he goes to Cambridge in Massachusetts and New Haven in Connecticut, and he preaches sermons against the colleges because they're not as enthusiastic for his message.
Okay.
But then 10 years later, he comes back and preaches these places again. And he said, well, I was pretty young. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So they actually have, there's a famous document by professors at Yale, I think 1742 or 43, is really quite opposed to Whitefield.
Okay.
6 or 7 years later, they're getting along well because Whitefield said, I was too extreme.
There we go.
Bruce Hindmarsh, teaching at Regent in Vancouver, really wonderful, wonderful historian of the evangelical awakenings, a real serious
Okay.
student of Whitefield. I think really likes Whitefield and appreciates what he did, but he did say, if you start publishing your journals when you're 22 or 23 years old, you're going to have a lot that you want to rewrite.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think the great thing about Whitefield was the clarity and the power of the message of free grace. I mean, that was obviously he and Wesley argued about what exactly free grace means,
Sure.
and the real, and this is from a book that appeared in a series that William B. Eerdmans that I helped publish by Harry Stout on Whitefield. Whitefield was smart in realizing that the props that it upheld Christian proclamation, Christian evangelism were falling away. So people were moving to the cities. There was a lot of criticism of the established church. There was some decay in the established church. Economically, there was a lot of independent things. So in some sense, the Christian message had to enter the marketplace. It had to compete. So he's a showman. He makes people cry when he pronounces what Mephibosheth.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. So that really positive. But then to say somebody's really positive, that's it. Is just, I mean, he was young. He made rash judgments. And then this book that I mentioned by Peter Choi actually emphasized the later Whitefield career when he becomes a kind of apologist for the British Empire. And other people, quite a few people now in our day, have drawn attention to the fact that Whitefield established an orphanage in Georgia that took in orphans who were being neglected, but he thought he needed enslaved people to make it a profit. So in his early trips to Georgia, he actually famous for preaching a sermon really blasting slave owners for treating their enslaved people as if they weren't humans made in the image of God. But later, he becomes an advocate of letting Georgia, which had been founded with a lot of evangelical impetus, letting Georgia now allow for slaves. So he becomes an apologist for slavery in Georgia. Well, does that mean his message is valueless? Does that mean his ability to preach the message of free grace doesn't mean anything? Of course not. But again, if you want to look at Whitefield, you got to have, from our perspective at the present, believing in the present, you have the good and the bad. I mean,
I think
that's true for almost all figures. And you want to avoid debunking, and you want to avoid a kind of false celebration. And it's tough. Not as metaphor is tough, not falling off one side of the horse.
I value you saying that because I don't know. I find in the church we can really quickly throw people out. I mean, I know so many that want to throw Luther out for this, or Calvin out for this, or all of the Puritans out for any of the slavery.
I couldn't agree more. And again, it's really, it takes an effort to keep two or three things in your mind at once. You say, Martin Luther, what he's had to say about the Jews later in life is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean you're not going to learn anything from Martin Luther? Well, no. Now, why can we say that? Because if we look inside ourselves, we can say, well, we can recognize God at work in us, and even recognize that some of the things we do by God's grace are actually very positive and are worth commending, not in our own strength, but commending for what we do with God's strength. And we see inside ourselves corruption, sinfulness needing to be eradicated. So
Yeah.
any person who has any believer who has any theology of sanctification
Yeah.
should have empathy in looking at others
Yeah.
historically. They say, yeah, Whitefield mistake. He was wrong in supporting slavery because it undercut. I mean, Whitefield is known among Africans and African Americans and African Britons as their friend. There's
Okay.
a wonderful story. I'm not going to remember the person's name, but he's in the colonies and he is converted and he's liberated and he's able to go to England and he shows up on Whitefield's doorstep. He needs help. He says, I know you would help me. And Whitefield does. He helps him. So you want to keep saying more than one thing,
Sure. Yeah.
but it's hard if you're doing a commercial
Yeah.
or a political ad to say more than one thing.
Yeah. I find more and more and maybe it's a cowardly thing to do, but I feel like often when I'm using examples in sermons from church history, often I'm not naming people when I quote them because I could say,
Yeah,
I quote Luther in this,
yeah,
and I feel like the whole congregation will be like, "Amen." But if I say Luther said, then all of a sudden I've lost
yeah. Then some of
lost
the people
people.
will say, "Well, isn't this the guy who said such terrible things about the
Yep.
Jews, or who said terrible things about everybody, but he got irritated?"
Yeah. Yeah. Uh well, I appreciate the few comments there on Whitfield because that's so interesting. Because again, I was just fascinated by his life. Maybe early on, especially being a young person
Right, right,
and starting to read him and being like, "Well, this is
right,
on this man is remarkable," and he's 20 whatever.
right. Yeah, yeah. No, no, and it was, I think, to his credit, even when he became the preaching sensation in London, um, in some sense, it did go to his head because
Okay.
when he gets to the colonies, and even he's very quick to see a situation and then to judge it. But I would say, and that's a problem. I think that's actually a flaw. But I do think a dispassionate, objective reading would say that despite that mistake, that flaw, he was not out to just exalt himself.
Okay.
So he like John Wesley, he never had any real money.
Hmm.
I mean, he raised tons and tons of money for his orphanage, and probably some of it didn't get spent exactly right,
Sure.
but he did not aggrandize his own personal possessions. And
Yeah.
same with Wesley. I mean, Wesley died with a few pounds in his name, and tens of thousands of pounds had flowed through his hands.
Yeah.
And that life record is to me a very strong testimony.
Hmm.
Again, not without flaws, not without mistakes,
Sure.
but a real strong indication of gracious divine
Yeah.
action at work in the person.
Well, I hope, I mean, I'm not going to be remembered in history by a wide audience, but I hope in my lineage, I hope they have grace when they look back because I'm
Yeah,
sure there are things that I don't see right
right,
now.
right,
They're going to look back and be like, Grandpa,
right.
he drove a fossil fuel car or he
Yeah,
did
exactly.
this or
Right,
whatever.
right,
I
right,
don't know, but
right, right.
yeah.
I think that in the Canadian situation, I've been just enjoying. I mean, I actually got to teach a course in Notre Dame called the North American Alternative
Okay.
Introduction to Canadian History. So I've been following it for years and years.
Okay.
But I think the relatively recent attention on the residential schools and the treatment of First Nations has been very positive in the sense of trying to see clearly what had happened. But
Yeah.
if whenever, now again, I'm an outsider, so I probably shouldn't be saying these things about not my own country. But if the abuses of the residential system become the entire story,
Yeah.
then you scratch your head and say, well, why is it that a pretty healthy minority of First Nations people today want to identify with the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And you say, well, haven't they read the Truth and Reconciliation? Well, of course they know about it.
Yeah.
Same thing, well, not the same thing, a parallel to what I think I've researched at great length for the American. How is it that you get a flourishing Black Christian experience in the United States?
Sure.
How is it you get a flourishing Black attachment to the Bible? When, at least until the Civil War, more white Christians, North as well as South, didn't see any problem with Black enslavement than did.
Okay.
Well, because the evil that was placed upon Africans in the US was not the only thing going on. And I think I would say in the Canadian situation, the evil of the residential system wasn't the only thing happening.
Sure.
Now, that, of course, that you can sound like an apologist then, and somebody trying to ease the burden, but
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I also think we need people from outside the situation to speak into it. I mean, maybe not so unlike, I feel like, Wesley and them, some of the Europeans were able to see things maybe in the colonies that
Right.
those in the situation weren't seeing.
Right, definitely. Yeah, actually being able to listen to outsiders talk about yourself and not be defensive is I think is a positive Christian virtue.
Yeah. Yeah, something that we're lacking right now, I think, to
Right.
hear criticism or hear feedback.
Right.
Well, can I ask you this, Dr. Noll? How
Sure.
do you think the place and influence of the Bible in America or in American culture has now changed through the years? Obviously it's a hard thing to sum up, probably.
Yeah.
It's been such a
Well, I do think just that the culture become more pluralized.
Yeah.
There are more alternatives within Christian communities. There's more alternatives for organizing your life outside of Christian communities. So I just think there's almost an inevitable decline of influence generally if the culture generally is more pluralistic. So
Okay.
much of the period of time I study, until the 1830s, there really are a very small percentage of Americans are Catholic. And until the 1870s or 80s, there's just a minuscule percentage of Jews. But if you have Jews and Catholics in your society, you're still going to have an orientation toward the Bible, but it's going to be quite different in Protestant, Catholic, and Jews. It's interesting. Early public education in the United States routinely required daily reading from the King James Bible because there was a consensus that a republic needed people have internal moral virtue if it's going to work. And how do you do that better? Well, you just do the Bible. People don't even think about it. That's just what you did.
Okay.
And then Cincinnati, New England, you have Catholic parents sending their kids to the tax-supported schools, and they say, well, we believe the Bible too, but this King James Version, we've been told we should be reading other versions. So what do you do? And then there was actually what was called the Bible War in Cincinnati for a number of years. Should the tradition of having the King James Bible being read in schools be continued? And that was a center of some Jewish settlement. And one of the leading rabbis kind of made a joke, but it really wasn't a joke. He said, I'm all for reading the scriptures, but if you're going to do it, you should be doing it in Hebrew.
Okay, sure.
He didn't say Greek because, but I think what he meant is, well, if you're going to be Christian and you read the Bible, you should do it in Greek. Well, of course, people weren't going to read Hebrew to the first graders, but and you do actually see later in American history when the pluralization of society just made it impossible. You do actually see some Jewish leaders, right almost to the present, saying one of the real strengths of American society is its biblical foundation. Now, they won't say making everybody read the King James Bible at the start of the school day is a good thing.
Sure.
But they will see that. So, And then the question of biblical literacy, of course, is one too. And there is so many more competitors for mental attention.
Yep.
I'm struck in so much of the research in earlier American history. You could expect ministers to be fluent in the Bible, but some of
Yep.
them, it looks like they couldn't speak without every paragraph or so quoting a Bible verse, and pretty accurately.
Yeah.
And then you would get ordinary people, women who were not necessarily educated as well, very often would be fluent in the scriptures. Slaves, sometimes not even literate, will have a tremendous mental grasp of the scripture and be able to
Okay.
quote a wonderful story about David George, who actually, there's a Canadian angle here too.
Okay.
He was a slave in South Carolina, liberated by the British during the American Revolution, helped found one of the first Baptist churches in South Carolina,
Oh, interesting.
and was taken by the British to Nova Scotia
Okay.
with other loyalists, helped found a Baptist church there. Eventually taken to Sierra Leone, helped found a Baptist church in Africa. So really tremendous Christian leader. But he was converted by hearing a sermon on Matthew 16, "Come to me, all who are weary," and
Okay.
then took training with the person who had gave him the sermon, learned the scriptures, and began preaching himself before he could read.
Oh,
So
interesting.
he would be given a passage and memorize it and think about it and preach it. And so that kind of deep, intense familiarity with the Bible is,
Yeah.
with a few exceptions, I just don't think we see it anymore. But
Well, I
and
mean,
that's a loss.
reading any of the Puritans, but I find especially
Yeah,
reading
yeah.
Edwards, I'm just always blown away on how many biblical references he can pull without Bible software. You
He's
know,
not
like
he's not flipping, he's not going to check either.
yeah, yeah, incredible. So in some ways I feel like maybe biblical literacy is, I don't know, gotten better in the ease of things, but in other ways I feel like we're,
Right.
I don't
Yes. I
know,
mean,
so
yeah,
removed from.
I think that's a very, very important thing to note. I'm myself personally, I really like the King James Bible, but I
Okay,
realize if that's the Bible, there's going to be most of the public not going to get it.
sure,
So we really having the modern trend, and some are better, some are worse for different reasons, but
yeah,
having the Bible in a language that people understand is really important. Even though the downside is, if you're going to memorize some scripture, which version are you going to use? And
sure.
then if you're going to, that's a problem.
Am I feel like maybe I read this in something you wrote. Am I right in thinking that when other Bible translations started to English translations started to show up in the US, that people still kind of weren't too
Right,
interested. They were locked
right.
in on the King James.
Yeah, right until after World War II.
Okay.
So you had some good experiments in the 1920s. There was a revision of the King James Version in the late 19th century that received tremendous publicity because of how much people valued the Bible.
Okay.
The revised version was brought over from England in 1881 or 1882, and there were like 1 million copies sold in the first week.
Ooh,
Uh, but it didn't catch on, and
okay.
I think really only really after World War II and the Living Bible, the New English Bible, Revised Standard Version, all of these were had their own constituencies, and I think it's really in my lifetime, but the King James Version, certainly that was the Bible that was just taken for granted. And
Why did the King James so capture the heart of
well, I think it was
America?
just it was just people. It was just for many the Bible for
Okay.
Protestants, and a generation of preaching, memorization, personal Bible study.
Okay.
Just had given it the kind of residual place in the churches, but also in the culture. So you get, I mean, one of the things I've worked on over the years is Abraham Lincoln's use of the Bible, and he read the Bible. He knew it. He could quote it. Sometimes just to make political points. Toward the end of his life in the American Civil War, he was actually quoting it with almost a spiritual purpose. But people who are serious about Lincoln scholarship know he never joined a church.
Okay.
He never claimed to be a conventional Christian believer. My own sense is that he was moving in that direction, but that's contested.
Okay.
But here's someone who really is not a church person, but is very adept at quoting from the scriptures. And that would have been the case just many times over. So it was just part of the cultural fabric.
Maybe a hypothetical, impossible question, but where do you think America would be right now without the Bible? I mean, in terms of people that now would be like, we don't need it, forget it. Like, as a historian, you can probably kind of, as they're saying that, think, well, you're not realizing how much of your life is because of the place the Bible had.
Right. Yes, I mean, we mentioned the Tom Holland book earlier, and I think that's really a good demonstration that an awful lot of what looks today like simple humanitarianism has a very strong biblical root. So treating marginal people as if they're important. Well, you say, well, that's just humanism. Well, it is, but it's humanism that at least is connected to the biblical understanding that everybody's made in the image of God. Why are the marginalized, why are people who others despise actually important? Because God does not despise them. Now, that can become a kind of humanism that just people are good because people are good. But and again, this is an opinion from an opinionated Christian observer. Where do you find the root of that belief? I think it's very much biblical.
Yeah. Can you see is it possible to see some good in the Bible shifting kind of maybe out of the political realm? Like, I don't know if it's possible to look back and see the central place the Bible kind of had. Was there a kind of nominalism in the way that maybe like there are benefits to Christendom maybe breaking down a little? And
exactly. I think the history of the public use of the Bible shows how useful and important it can be and how dangerous it can be.
Okay.
So during the American Civil War, a lot of Northern ministers preached sermons showing God was on their side. A lot of Southern ministers preached sermons, God was on their side. Well, they really were not looking at the Bible. They were using the scriptures to support what they thought was the case. And that kind of civil religion undercuts biblical Christianity.
Okay.
I would say that this is my friend and historical colleague George Marsden has made a very strong point in saying secularization from some angles is a good thing because it leads to a situation where individuals are not trying artificially to sway public life on the basis of what they think the Bible teaches. Now, he hastens on to say there's immense problems with secularization too. So, but if you mean by secular the division of authority between the believers and the general community, that's quite positive. And the U.S. history is just full of examples of people using biblical materials for kind of partisan ends, silly, self-serving ends. And in that respect, getting Christianity or the Bible out of visible public life can be a good thing. Okay. Now, ideally, you want Christian values to be at the foundation of believers and even non-believers who are active in public life, but lowering the visibility, it would be a real good thing.
That's where Canada and the U.S. can be so different. And maybe the U.S. is catching up kind of to us in this way, where I heard one of the Republican candidates or whatever say a little while ago, we're going to restore the Bible to its kind of that founding father era. and it's probably good for his political campaign. No politician in Canada is
Right,
using that as a platform. It's not going to help you. It's going to hurt you. You know, the Bible's been removed
right,
from that.
right.
I don't know
But
that.
one of the things that got me interested in Canadian history was coming to know evangelical historians in
Okay.
Canada who just did not share, just didn't have the American instinct. So
Okay.
I have a very good friend who's now been deceased for 25 years, George Ryley, was a historian at Queen's in University in Kingston, was helped sponsor the evangelical groups on campus and
Okay.
a lot of research on revivalist in the colonial period. He was a specialist in the revivalist Henry Allen, who was called the Whitefield of Nova Scotia, the Whitefield of
Interesting.
America.
Okay.
A very vigorous and actually effective
Okay.
evangelist. So, and here's this, and George was very active in his Baptist church in Kingston, but he was a strong supporter of the New Democratic Party. So he said, lifelong socialist. And
Okay.
I think, well, scratch my head. So, we don't have a whole lot of Baptist socialists in the
Yeah.
United States. Yeah, at least in the 80s and 90s, and I think it's changed now some in Canada, but there would be, for example, some pro-life people in the
Sure.
NDP
Yep.
and the liberals as well as the progressive conservatives. So
Yeah.
yeah, you just didn't have the same salience of religious identifiers,
Yeah.
and I think comes from Canada's history, so where the Catholic Protestant divide was so important for so
Okay.
long. And people said, well, we just need a different way of operating in public life.
Yeah. Well, I think well, clearly your knowledge of Canadian history is far greater than mine as a Canadian. I'd like
Well,
to
it's been
one
a
day
lot
pick your
of
brain
fun, a
on
lot of
Canada.
fun, a lot of fun to try to
Well,
learn a little.
my last question for you, Dr. Noll, not to keep you longer, but I'd just be
Sure.
curious what have been some of the books that have been impactful in your life, whether in scholarship, in your own devotional life? Are there any that stand out as
Well, I mean, the history books have been the ones that have impressed me. I mentioned Roland Bainton's Life of Martin Luther. Early on, I was greatly impressed by a book on the English Reformation by A.G. Dickens.
okay?
That he was an excellent historian of politics and society, but could show how the Christian faith, the people like Thomas Cranmer, also were very important. I mean, I think maybe I've done some lectures and wrote a little book on C.S. Lewis. I mean, I think Lewis is really a terrific.
Was there a particular Lewis book that first caught your attention, or that was
Well,
especially
I'm not sure. I know we read the Narnia tales to our kids
okay?
several times. I was really impressed. I had read Mere Christianity before and Mere
Okay.
Christianity afterwards. I really like this is not a book that I think many people will read, but I really like Lewis's history
Okay.
of English literature of the 16th century. He has wonderful sections on a lot of Christian writers and very discerning, but it's more of a historical work.
Okay.
Um, I mentioned a biography of John Winthrop by Edmund Morgan is just a terrific book, again by a non-believing historian, but who recognizes how important Christian faith was for John Winthrop, the founder
Yeah.
of Massachusetts. I really like the Lord of the Rings, like so many people do.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I've just read too many things to
Yeah.
have.
No, that's fine. But even I'm
It was
just, I mean, I feel like I often, well, my book reading list usually comes from biographies or
right.
footnotes or whatever. So this in the same way, just hearing what
I will say
the people I read are reading.
the two-volume autobiography of Malcolm Muggeridge
Okay.
is just wonderful. You do have the suspicion that a little bit of it is fiction rather than just autobiography,
Yeah.
but it's a terrific book. And then I used to assign in class when I had a chance to do any kind of African history, the book by Alan Paton, Cry the Beloved Country, which I think
Okay.
is just one of the great novels, but it's also a great Christian novel
Okay.
of the recent past.
Well, I'm reading Whitfield at times. I've wondered,
Yeah,
is this a little fictional or is this,
right.
uh,
The journals particularly. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, he did have a chance to revise them though.
yeah. Well, Dr. Noll, again, I just want to thank you for
Oh
taking the
well,
time to talk to me. I
yeah,
really
good. I did.
appreciate it.
I'm glad to do so, particularly because I do think in our day, where there is actually a lot of good Christian scholarship,
Hmm.
that the scholars need to be in the churches, and the
Yeah,
churches need to at least have one ear for the scholars,
yeah,
and not to be going their separate way. So
yep,
trying to mediate between the academics and the pews, and trying to keep both people connected to each other.
yeah.
That's
Well, and apart from just biblical scholarship, I feel like church history is
yeah,
something that is
yeah,
so often, ironically, missing from the church. So,
way too often, right?
yeah.